Great. Well, yeah, thank you so much to the folks at UMass for having me and setting all this up, and thanks everyone for being here. I always learn so much from these Wednesday mornings when there's an IQW, and I hope everybody finds this talk informative and interesting at least. I am going to be sharing some results of a postdoc I've been doing split between here at University at Buffalo and University of Alaska Fairbanks, trying to better understand how permafrost carbon interacted with the massive global warming event that accompanied the last deglaciation. And whenever I give a talk about permafrost, I always choose this as a title slide from the Lena River Delta in Siberia, in part because I think it's just a really extraordinary image, but I think it also goes a long way in demonstrating how kind of diverse and heterogeneous the permafrost domain can be, even over a relatively small spatial scale. If you spend enough time staring at this picture as I have, you can kind of get a sense for all the different processes which are overlapping and competing with one another here. Fluvial and geomorphic processes, as well as ecological processes, all interacting with the cryosphere to create this really extraordinary landscape, which is really exciting to study from pretty much any Earth system perspective. And you can also imagine that this diversity and heterogeneity really scales up when you start thinking about the permafrost domain across the whole northern hemisphere. You can see in this image on the left here, permafrost area is shaded in purple, and it spans from down in the tropics and high mountain Asia all the way up to these periglacial environments in Greenland. And you can also kind of imagine the sheer volume and diversity of ecological settings which are underlain by permafrost, everything from these vast expanses of taiga and boreal forest to much more phytomass poor regions of steppe and tundra. Because permafrost, which I should say is defined as ground which remains frozen for more than 2 years in a row, because it covers this much land area, it's really hard to come up with a single unifying statement about the permafrost domain that holds true for all of these vastly different geographic settings, other than that it's frozen. In addition, in aggregate, and I think this is the focus of a lot of interesting research on permafrost, in aggregate, it holds a globally really significant amount of carbon. You can see here in this figure on the right that soils in the northern permafrost region hold substantially more soil than the entirety of Earth's atmosphere. And so this is kind of the focus of a lot of discourse and research about permafrost and the permafrost domain. But as quaternary scientists, I think another reason that we tend to care a lot about permafrost is because it provides this really unique opportunity to understand these remarkably preserved quaternary histories because it acts as this globally significant freezer unit for organic carbon. These two images are taken from the Cold Regions Research Engineering Laboratory permafrost tunnel outside of Fairbanks, Alaska. And if you ever get a chance to go tour the tunnel, I highly recommend it. It's a really interesting experience. But you can see the fact that this ground has been frozen for so long preserves all sorts of extraordinary stuff in really exquisite condition. I don't know if you can make out, but dangling from the ceiling here, there's just an abundance of Pleistocene root material, which looks as though it could come right back to life. You also see these extraordinary forms created by ground ice, and you can start to get a sense for what the overlying landscape would do if this ground ice were to melt. And additionally, if you're interested in megafaunal remains, it's really hard to overstate the sheer density and abundance of fascinating things like this big steppe bison horn, which is just protruding out of the wall here. And so just kind of by walking around in the permafrost tunnel, you can really start to get a sense for what a special feature of the Earth system locking all this organic carbon up is. But obviously, a lot of the kind of contemporary concern about permafrost comes from the fact that permafrost landscapes and the vast carbon reservoirs contained therein are warming at a global scale. And that's demonstrated nicely here in this figure from Biskuborn et al. 2019, which demonstrates that permafrost is both warming worldwide in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. And part of this, I should say, is an obvious consequence of things like rising air temperature and Arctic amplification. But these kind of more complicated and hidden environmental variables can also drive substantial changes in the permafrost domain. For example, in the discontinuous permafrost zone in panel B here, a lot of that is not just attributed to rising air temperatures, but to increased snow cover during warmer and wetter winters. And that overlying snowpack insulates the underlying ground from the coldest temperatures of the year, which would lower the climatic threshold necessary to induce thawing. And so this, I think, is another example of how the permafrost domain is this really broad and vast and heterogeneous setting that it's hard to make kind of a single distinctive and encompassing claim about this landscape as a whole. There's really a lot going on, and it's quite a complex and compelling component of the Earth system to study. So the vulnerability of permafrost carbon to future warming obviously constitutes some of the primary concern about how stable this region is likely to be in the future. And this can basically be described by this concept of the permafrost carbon feedback, which is illustrated in this figure on the left here. Essentially, the permafrost carbon feedback just describes the process by which increasing surface temperatures will increase the depth of this seasonally unfrozen active layer here. This in turn exposes previously frozen carbon to temperatures where microbial decomposition and respiration can occur. Microbial decomposition and respiration will then release some of that carbon as carbon dioxide or methane, making its way back into the atmosphere, which will increase surface temperatures, and the whole cycle, in theory, might perpetuate itself. And so that process describes the permafrost carbon feedback. When I refer to that term for the remainder of the talk, that's just what I'm referring to. This figure on the right here shows some efforts to model how strong this permafrost carbon feedback is likely to be in the coming centuries as a kind of added component of anthropogenic warming. I think most folks are more familiar looking at atmospheric carbon in terms of parts per million CO2. So I've just overlaid that on top here. And something that might jump out at you is that the scale of uncertainty associated with each of these individual estimates is quite large. We're talking about individual estimate uncertainty, which encompasses about all of the carbon dioxide, which has made its way into the atmosphere from 1950 to present. And by the time you start talking about differences between estimates, it's much larger. The inter-ent estimate difference here of the amount of permafrost carbon released by the year 2300 is about all of the carbon dioxide that made its way into the atmosphere between the last glacial maximum and 1950. So that's the difference between a vertical mile of ice sitting on top of me here in Buffalo and the Truman administration. So this is a component of the Earth system that is potentially fairly poorly constrained. And anything we can do to get a better sense for how this big permafrost carbon reservoir interacts with high latitude warming is potentially very informative and very valuable for understanding what we're up against in the coming centuries. But because we are quaternary scientists and because we have this wealth of existing evidence at our disposal in the form of the geologic record, we have decided to use the last global deglaciation from about 21,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago as a kind of natural experiment to try to better understand how this big permafrost carbon reservoir responds to massive high latitude warming. And so we can ask this question: did permafrost carbon contribute substantially to the greenhouse gas increases which occurred during the last deglaciation? And we can start to frame some more specific questions, such as, if a strong permafrost carbon feedback was crucial to deglacial greenhouse gas increases, then one, we should expect to see abrupt increases in greenhouse gases occurring synchronously with rapid warming in the Northern Hemisphere. And I've just overlain blue boxes where greenhouse gases are changing rapidly during the deglacial sequence. Number two, there should be abundant evidence of permafrost degradation contemporaneous with or just before these major increases in atmospheric greenhouse gases. And three, although I won't talk about this quite as much, greenhouse gases preserved in ice cores should retain the relatively distinctive isotopic signatures of permafrost carbon. And that's basically just because permafrost carbon is photosynthetically fixed, and there's a strong biological preference for the light carbon-12 isotope. So we expect it to be depleted with respect to this heavy carbon-13. Additionally, because permafrost carbon is old compared with the contemporaneous atmosphere, we expect it to be relatively poor with respect to radiocarbon. And so in addition to seeing warming and evidence of permafrost degradation occurring at the same time as these greenhouse gas increases, we expect to see characteristic changes in the isotopic composition of greenhouse gases overlain in the dotted black lines here as well. So in order to answer this first question of what the ambient climate was accompanying these periods of rapid warming and rapid greenhouse gas increases, our collaborators at Northern Arizona University, Chris Hancock and Nick McKay, have given us the use of this really extraordinary high latitude paleoclimate proxy temperature database. You can see the spatial distribution of sites in this map here on the left, and we have temporal coverage spanning the kind of early Holocene here all the way back to the last glacial maximum. And we're effectively just going to query this database to see whether those periods of abrupt greenhouse gas increases that I highlighted in blue a couple slides ago are accompanied by rapid warming, accompanied by rapid cooling, or not accompanied by a clear climate signature at all. To answer the second question, and this is really going to constitute the bulk of the remainder of the talk, we need to look across the Northern Hemisphere for evidence of permafrost degradation. And I think the really kind of new part about this study is this attempt to try to get a sense for what the whole Northern Hemisphere permafrost domain was doing during deglaciation. We have designed kind of two different approaches, which are entirely distinctive from one another. And we're going to cross our fingers and hope that these two different approaches wind up telling a similar story. The first of these approaches involves aggregating and synthesizing bottom-up geological evidence of permafrost degradation from around the Arctic to see when and where observed incidences of permafrost thaw was occurring. And I've chosen this image of an enormous slump feature from Siberia here because I think it starts to demonstrate how instances of permafrost degradation can really work their way into the geologic record. You can see this whole wall has basically detached in this slump feature as a result of thawing. And you can see it's left a really enormous geomorphic piece of geomorphic evidence. It's recorded in the stratigraphy here, but you can also start to imagine there are big biogeochemical consequences for this type of mass wasting as well. And so we're basically going to probe the existing literature for observations of this nature spanning that kind of interesting deglacial time period. We have lumped the types of permafrost degradation indicators into four distinct categories. The first of which is probably the most widely observed and widely understood, in part thanks to the work of Katie Walter Anthony, and that is basal ages of thermokarst lakes. If you spend much time zooming around the high Arctic on Google Earth, you will notice these really distinctive shaped ponds up there. And these are thermokarst lakes. They're basically a function of thawing of ground ice, which causes the overlying land area to subside and intersect with the water table, which forms these really distinctive ponds, which have very small surface areas, but can be quite deep. And if you can get a radiocarbon age from the basal unit of a thermokarst lake, it gives you a kind of minimum limiting constraint on when that ground ice thawed. Our second category are speleothems and cryogenic cave carbonates. And the principle behind this is relatively simple. In the bottom panel here, you can imagine the overburden of this cave during a cold time period where there's stable permafrost will prevent water from percolating through and making its way down into the cave, which will prevent the formation and aggradation of these calcium carbonate minerals. But if that overburden thaws and you can start moving liquid water through that system, then you can start precipitating speleothems and cryogenic cave carbonates within the cave. And so a uranium thorium date that constrains the onset of that growth period, again, represents a kind of indicator of when this overburden thawed enough to start forming the calcium carbonate minerals. Our third category is a bit of a grab bag. There's some diverse sources of evidence represented in here, and that is geomorphic indicators. This can mean anything from thaw unconformities, as you see in this image here, and as you saw a few slides ago, or it could potentially be things like river plane aggradation, which could tell you when finely grained material, which had previously been locked up in permafrost, was released rapidly and kind of contributed to the aggradation of big river plains, or smaller things like truncated sand wedge casts. So this one is a bit of a diverse category. Our final category is age offsets and biogeochemical proxies. The principle behind using age offsets to get at the magnitude of permafrost degradation is essentially that if you have a continuous sedimentary sequence here, and you get a bulk radiocarbon shown in the yellow and blue over here at the exact same sediment horizon as a macrofossil, which you see in green and red here, then the magnitude of that offset, you can see these bulk ages are meaningfully older than the macrofossil ages. That magnitude indicates the amount of old permafrost carbon moving through that system. And so the greater this magnitude, potentially, the greater the degree of permafrost degradation, which is moving through the landscape at that time. So we can take observations from each of those four categories, which all have median age estimates and chronological uncertainty associated with them, and treat them as probability density functions. And you can see that on the left here. I've just chosen 3 dates at random. You can see these are all derived from radiocarbon. You can tell by the strange hummocky shapes of the PDF. Time is on the x-axis here. And what we do is we just add all of these different PDFs together to get what we're going to call a composite thaw index, which you can see on the bottom here for those 3 dates. And the way that we interpret this is fairly simple. Essentially, higher values on the y-axis indicates a greater degree of permafrost thaw. But instead of doing that for 3 dates, we do it for the entire 400 plus dates that we've aggregated from across the Northern Hemisphere. Highlighted in blue here is the mapped extent of the last glacial maximum permafrost domain. The gray shading indicates the large Northern Hemisphere ice sheets. And the different solid black shapes here indicate sites of permafrost degradation. And you can see we've got pretty broad spatial coverage. We have sites as far south as what is today New Jersey and as far north as Svalbard. So we really encompass a pretty broad swath of the last glacial maximum permafrost domain. And you can start to get a sense for the chronology of these observations in this cumulative observation chart on the right here. Okay, so that does it for our first approach. Our second approach, which again is completely independent of the first, entails estimating the amount of permafrost carbon which is at risk of thawing during deglaciation. And to do this, we take a map of last glacial maximum permafrost distribution and associated carbon density, which was developed by Lindgren et al. In 2018. And we expose it to warming from the gridded paleo temperature data output of the last glacial maximum reanalysis. I can kind of demonstrate a simplified schematic of this in this slide here for a single grid cell, which is highlighted in red here in Central Europe. And so effectively, based on modern observations, we understand that there is very little continuous permafrost at temperatures above -6 degrees for mean annual temperatures. And so we can take this grid cell, which is mapped as continuous permafrost with this characteristic carbon density at the last glacial maximum. And we could look at the last glacial maximum reanalysis to see what the estimated temperature is. It's indeed far below -6 degrees. We then kind of move through the time series here and wait until that grid cell rises above -6 degrees for 1,000 years or more. At this point, we say that it goes from continuous permafrost to discontinuous permafrost, which has a different, lesser carbon density. We multiply the difference between those two carbon densities by the land area represented in that grid cell, and we get a volume of a mass of carbon at risk of respiration into the atmosphere. We further know, based on modern observations, that there's not really any discontinuous permafrost at temperatures above -1 degree Celsius. And so when that grid cell rises above -1 degree Celsius, we then say the remainder of that carbon is at risk of respiration to the atmosphere. And I want to stress that this is carbon that is at risk of respiration rather than carbon that is actually being respired. As I'll talk about a bit later in the talk, just because a parcel of land thaws, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily immediately emitting all that carbon back into the atmosphere. This is really just an attempt to gauge the total amount of carbon which is experiencing thaw-inducing temperatures, so we can get a sense of when and where the permafrost domain is contracting during deglaciation. We also have to account for permafrost carbon in these kind of vast low-lying land areas of Siberia, which is exposed to rising sea levels. You can see here in this image how much of this coastline is ice and organic-rich permafrost. And as that coastline is exposed to wave erosion as a result of rising sea levels, that permafrost is going to be transferred from the terrestrial pool into the marine. And we're going to say that this carbon is also at risk of respiration into the atmosphere, although much of it will be buried in marine sediments. And so to get at this, we just take the ICE7G global isostatic adjustment model and figure out when different parcels of the permafrost domain are subjected to rising sea levels at different points during the deglacial. And we add that amount of carbon to the carbon that we estimate as vulnerable due to warming. And so that constitutes approach 2. And so we can take both of those approaches and look at these 3 windows where greenhouse gases were increasing rapidly. The first of these windows occurs between 17.5 and 16,000 years ago. This is approximately during Heinrich Stadial 1. You can see in this top image here, both carbon dioxide and methane increase in tandem with one another over the course of this period. And if we go down to this map, these shaded cool colored circles here are temperature proxy data points, which don't indicate warming, but actually indicate cooling. And this is consistent with how we generally think of Heinrich Stadial 1. This is not a time period that is generally considered to be rapidly warming across the Arctic. Instead, it's widely thought to be a relatively cool time in the Northern Hemisphere. This is also reflected in the comparative lack of permafrost degradation observations, which you can see in the solid black shapes here. And you can also see that very little land area in light and dark purple here, according to our carbon vulnerability analysis, is rising above temperatures which are necessary to induce thawing. It's just a little bit of land area here down at the southern extent of the permafrost domain. Additionally, if you go across the Northern Hemisphere at this time period, there's a fair amount of good evidence that permafrost was actually aggrading and quite stable during Heinrich Stadial 1. And that is everything from examples of patterned ground formation, which you can see up top here in Hungary, as well as more high latitude instances of stable permafrost, such as the accumulation of these really extraordinary ice-rich Yedema sequences in northern Alaska. And you can see all the way up here, there's a person for scale. These are really dramatic and substantial ice-rich formations that don't indicate permafrost thaw, but rather indicate permafrost aggradation. So in all, Heinrich Stadial 1 would be a potentially interesting time for there to be widespread carbon releases from permafrost, because we generally understand it to have been relatively cool in the Northern Hemisphere. The second time of rapid greenhouse gas changes occurs between 14.5 and 13.5 thousand years before present, approximately during the Bowling-Allarod. You can see here methane increases really rapidly at the beginning of the Bowling-Allarod and then kind of tapers off for the remainder. The same is true, but to a lesser extent for carbon dioxide. There's a bit of an increase at the beginning of the BA, and then it stabilizes as you move through the next 800 years or so. And the Bowling-Allarod is generally thought to have been a relatively warm time period in the Northern Hemisphere. You can see this in these warm colored circles, which represent, again, paleoclimate proxy data, which indicates rapid warming during this greenhouse gas window. You also see a much greater degree of these black solid shapes, indicating our permafrost degradation observations. And a much larger expanse of land area is being exposed to rising temperatures across the Asian Pacific here, as well as some in Central Europe and the rapidly deglaciating North America mid-latitudes here. A lot of permafrost degradation observations during this time period also derive from near-shore marine environments, and you can see that in this panel here on the left, which indicates big transfers of permafrost carbon from the landscape into marine sediments, really coincident with meltwater pulse 1A here, kind of at the beginning of the Bowling-Allarod. Although there are also permafrost degradation observations from more continental settings, such as these truncated sand wedge casts, which had previously been filled in with ground ice. So the Bowling-Allarod is a bit of a more compelling time period in terms of the role of permafrost and permafrost carbon in potentially driving deglacial greenhouse gas emissions. The final time period where deglacial greenhouse gases increase rapidly is during the Younger Dryas. And the Younger Dryas is certainly a time period we don't think of as being particularly warm in the Northern Hemisphere. This is really nicely reflected in our paleoclimate proxy observations in these cool blue colors here. You can see cooling distributed pretty widely across the Northern Hemisphere. There aren't a ton of these solid black circles indicating permafrost degradation. And again, I should also say there's no landscape area highlighted in purple here, which indicates that our carbon vulnerability analysis really does not identify any area of the permafrost domain which is being exposed to thaw-inducing temperatures. And additionally, there's some really dramatic evidence of permafrost aggradation during the Younger Dryas, such as these enormous syngenetic ice wedge complexes here in northern Siberia, as well as more modest but still kind of fascinating sedimentological indicators like these drop-shaped cryogenic involutionary structures, which are formed by cryogenic processes and date to this time period of relative cooling across the northern hemisphere. So the Younger Dryas, again, would be a very curious time indeed to see widespread permafrost thawing and a strong permafrost carbon feedback. We could look at this all as a time series here. In panel A on top, these are the results of our composite thaw index. The purple bars indicate the 5th and 95th percent confidence interval based on a resampling strategy, and the black dots indicate the median. And you can see, based on comparing it with our carbon vulnerability analysis in panel B, these two completely independent methods of reconstructing permafrost vulnerability tell very similar stories, which is really encouraging. And most crucially, they both suggest that the time period when the Northern Hemisphere was experiencing maximum permafrost thaw was during the early Holocene here, after these abrupt increases in greenhouse gases. If we look down in panels C and D, we can see that greenhouse gases had already been stable for about a millennium before maximum permafrost degradation occurred, according to both of our different metrics. I also want to take a bit of time to talk about other potential sources of greenhouse gases during deglaciation. And I'm going to kind of drastically oversimplify the literature here, but one prevailing hypothesis is a lot of the carbon dioxide came out of the Southern Ocean as a result of stronger Southern Hemisphere westerlies, which led to increased upwelling of carbon-rich deep waters. And when those carbon-rich deep waters are exposed to the atmosphere, you can flux a lot of that carbon out. So Southern Hemisphere westerlies, more CO2 outgassing, that potentially explains part of the CO2 increase. And methane is thought to be largely controlled by seasonally inundated tropical land area as a result of stronger monsoons. And basically, when the tropical monsoon systems are strong, a lot of this underlying, tropical low-lying land area is seasonally covered by water, which leads to increased anaerobic respiration and more methane production. So stronger tropical monsoons might be driving increases in methane. And we can look again at our rapidly increasing greenhouse gases, which I've highlighted in gold here for CO2. This is during Heinrich Stadial 1. And compare that directly to our composite thaw index. I've highlighted that same time period in gold on the bottom here. And you can see while CO2 is increasing rapidly, our composite thaw index is relatively stable. And again, this is consistent with how we understand Heinrich Stadial 1. So if permafrost wasn't necessarily a big driver of this Heinrich Stadial 1 CO2 increase, we could look at something like the Antarctic ice core records, which do show isotope enrichments which are consistent with stronger Southern Hemisphere westerlies at the same time that CO2 is increasing rapidly. And so this might be a more parsimonious explanation for this period of abrupt CO2 increase. We can look at, for example, methane during the Bowling-Allarod. When you look at higher resolution ice core records of methane concentration, you can see a lot of this methane really makes its way into the atmosphere almost immediately at the onset of this time period. Our permafrost degradation indicators and our composite thaw index don't show this abrupt change. I will say that potentially, this method is not maybe up to the task of reconstructing really short-lived centennial scale changes like that. But at the same time, when you look at certain tropical monsoon records, you do see evidence for a stronger Indian summer monsoon, which looks a lot like more like the shape of this bowling alley rod methane rise. And so again, potentially there's a more convenient explanation to explain this greenhouse gas dynamic during the bowling alley rod. Finally, I'll just show one more so as not to show a million different time series plots, but we could look at carbon dioxide during the Younger Dryas. Again, our permafrost degradation indicators don't indicate a big increase in permafrost thaw. And again, the southern westerlies match this greenhouse gas curve much better and can be invoked to explain these carbon dioxide dynamics. So to return to this summary figure, it seems unlikely that a strong permafrost carbon feedback was a major contributor to deglacial greenhouse gas emissions. And that kind of answers this first question that we had. But it raises two more really important questions. If permafrost degradation was widespread but wasn't contributing net emissions to the atmospheric greenhouse gas curves during the early Holocene, which you can see again here around 10,000, 11,000 years ago, what were the factors that limited the permafrost carbon feedback? And finally, what are the implications of these paleo perspectives for future warming? You can broadly group the processes which constrain permafrost carbon loss into a couple of different categories. And the first category are sensitivity-related processes. And here again, I think it's important to highlight the heterogeneity and the diversity of the permafrost domain. A different area of the landscape's sensitivity to thaw is going to be very different from another. These processes can encompass things like incomplete respiration of organic carbon. What we're looking at here in this image is more of those kind of cryoturbated involutionary structures. And you can see in the dark colors how organic rich a lot of this material is. So while this sedimentary structure was formed by permafrost, it's important to note that this hasn't been permafrost for millennia. This photograph comes from the Netherlands, and this parcel of land would have ceased to be permafrost, 10 or 11,000 years ago. But you can see how much of that old carbon is still stored in the soils. A lot of this is probably quite refractory. And so while the labile component of that organic carbon might work its way into the atmosphere very quickly upon thawing, there's a lot of remnant carbon that stays in these soils. A lot of the permafrost domain, even if it thaws, is still subject to really short growing seasons and cold annual temperatures, which slows down these respiration processes. And can lead to kind of very different sensitivity in terms of carbon balance to thaw, depending on where in the permafrost domain you are. There are other processes like fluvial export and redeposition of thawed carbon. You can see here in this image, these thaw slump features are contributing old carbon into this river system. And that river is potentially just going to shuffle that carbon from the terrestrial domain here and deposit it either elsewhere in the terrestrial domain or in marine sediments. There's evidence that suggests that Siberian rivers alone sequester approximately 15 teragrams of carbon annually in marine sediments through this process. And so it's a globally pretty significant component of the permafrost carbon cycle. The second set of processes are actual negative feedbacks that constrain carbon loss during episodes of warming. This could encompass things like thermal buffering of permafrost as peat aggrades during warm periods. And this image here on the left is demonstrating modeling results, which show how important a thick blanket of peat can be at insulating the underlying ground from warming temperatures. The red line shows temperature when there is no peat. And you can see by the middle of the year, that ground actually gets quite warm. But when you put increasingly thick blankets of peat, it serves to really do a good job of keeping that permafrost underlying at really low temperatures throughout the year. And so when it's warmer, that peat aggrades. Additionally, it's important to note that warmer time periods can also lead to the proliferation of really organic rich soils as well. Peats can store a ton of carbon. We're looking here at a soil sequence from northern Alaska, and these two dark bands towards the top here were formed during the Bowling-Allerod and the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, 2 times of relative warming at high latitudes. And so increased productivity during longer, warmer, wetter growing seasons can not just stimulate more carbon respiration, but also lead to more carbon sequestration as well. And if we return to our kind of deglacial time series and compare our records of permafrost degradation in the purple bars on top and our carbon vulnerability analysis in the dotted black line here, to evidence of peatland establishment and boreal forest proliferation, which you can see below 0 on the x-axis in the green bars and the black dotted crosses, The timing of these two things is really consistent across the Northern Hemisphere. When you have maximum permafrost instability here in the early Holocene, you also have maximum peatland establishment. And so this is potentially indicating that you see big transfers of carbon from the permafrost reservoir into these newly establishing peat carbon sinks. But it's really crucial to acknowledge that the early Holocene was in a lot of ways really well equipped to store a lot of carbon in this way. This is a little bit confusing, so I'll take a bit of time trying to explain it. But the light colored purple on top here indicates permafrost degradation, which occurred on landscapes which were deglaciated, or which were glaciated at the last glacial maximum. The light colored green in the peatland establishment indicates peatlands which established on previously glaciated landscapes. You can see almost none of our permafrost degradation indicators happened on lands that were glaciated at the LGM, but almost all of these peatland establishment ages were. And so potentially all of this new land area, which is created by these receding ice sheets, is really crucial for allowing new peatlands and new boreal forests to proliferate. The inset in panel B here is just showing the relative proportions of both during these interesting time periods during deglaciation. And you can see throughout you have much more peat establishing than you do permafrost on previously deglaciated landscapes. That's a really important distinction between how the Northern Hemisphere looked during the early Holocene and how it looks today. Bioclimate subzone A, which is highlighted in purple here, is kind of our best modern analog for what recently deglaciated land might look like. It's the most phytomass and carbon poor landscape across the Arctic. And you can see it encompasses a really small proportion of the overall deglaciated Arctic. You can compare that to the amount of new landscape we had to store peat and to store carbon on between 11 and 10,000 years ago. And you can see they're not the same order of magnitude. That early Holocene carbon sink was potentially much larger as a result of these big swaths of Northern Hemisphere land area, which emerged as a result of deglaciation. And so in this way, the early Holocene is a pretty imperfect analog for how carbon storage on northern landscapes is likely to act in the future. I will also say that there are certain feedbacks where modern permafrost benefits from increased protections. The modern landscape has largely had 10,000 years or so of peat accumulation on top of permafrost. And you can see here, this ground ice is overlain by a fairly thick peat blanket, which insulates it from high summer temperatures. A lot more of this landscape probably looked something like this, with relatively thin soils and a relatively low climatic threshold, which would induce thawing at the early Holocene and during the late Pleistocene. And so while a lot more of the landscape was conducive to establishing new peatlands, permafrost during the early Holocene might have had a lower climatic threshold necessary to induce widespread thawing. And so this is a kind of pull in the opposite direction between the early Holocene and the modern. And it's these kind of processes which are really diverse across the Northern Hemisphere and which I think are potentially really valuable to study in the future. And I'll close by trying to contextualize this late Pleistocene, early Holocene permafrost carbon feedback with projections of future scenarios, which here are taken from a paper by McGuire et al. 2018. We can focus on these horizontal lines on the bottom here, which indicate kind of permafrost region ecosystem carbon flux. And you can see during the early Holocene and under relatively moderate emission scenarios like SSP 4.5, we expect this region to act as a fairly strong carbon sink. We're below zero here in terms of overall flux. And so if we keep kind of emissions in a relatively moderate pathway, we might expect to see a permafrost carbon system that behaves like it did during the early Holocene, when this permafrost carbon feedback was restrained by all the various negative feedbacks that are associated with frozen ground. However, when we move out to more extreme emission scenarios like SSP 8.5 here, we do start to anticipate seeing massive fluxes of permafrost carbon into the atmosphere. And so potentially really extreme warming scenarios can stimulate big losses of permafrost carbon. I've truncated the error bars here at 14 million squared kilometers because that's basically the extent of the modern permafrost area contraction being plotted along the x-axis here. And so that's basically saying that it's realistic that under SSP 8.5, you might lose the entirety of the Northern Hemisphere permafrost landscape. And that would be a really unique Arctic and Northern Hemisphere in the context of the Quaternary. We know this because there's examples of intact ground ice, which you can see highlighted in this white box here, which underlie really old tephra, like the Gold Run tephra here, deposited at about 740,000 years ago. This means that this ground ice remained intact throughout these long and really warm interglacials like MIS 11 and MIS 5. I'll also note that this ground ice is in the modern discontinuous permafrost zone. And it's underlain, as you can see in this image on the top here, by really fire-prone stretches of boreal forest. So whatever the negative feedbacks and the ecosystem protections that are buffering this ground ice from warming, they're really quite robust. And if these extreme warming scenarios were to stimulate the complete loss of Northern Hemisphere permafrost land area, it would probably be the first time that it's happened in a very, very long time. There is some evidence of massive permafrost carbon losses during pre-Quaternary warm periods, such as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And the permafrost carbon feedback might have been an important driver of these really extreme warmings, as indicated here in this figure by DeCanto et al. 2012. But we're talking about pre-Quaternary warm periods, and this is the International Quaternary webinar. So I think that is as good a place as any to start to wrap up with some key takeaways. So number one, permafrost carbon does not seem to have been a major contributor to deglacial greenhouse gas increases. Number two, thawed permafrost carbon during the early Holocene was largely offset by peats and boreal forests, which proliferated on recently deglaciated terrain. And number three, the early Holocene is an imperfect but valuable analog for modern warming. And I think there's also a kind of nice correspondence to some of the results that Josh Kazone shared last week, which demonstrated that with kind of more moderate emission scenarios, the threats that are posed by these kind of different